Welcome, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. I'm Michael Moreland. I teach here at the Law School at Villanova and direct the Eleanor H. McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy. I want to welcome you to our inaugural event of the 2023-24 academic year. We have some other programs planned, including our annual Law and Religion lecture in November 7th, with Helen Alvarez from George Mason Law School, who's actually also a Villanova alumna, but more details about that. If you registered for this event, you'll be on our email list, but if you would otherwise like to be on our email list, just let me or Melanie Dudley know, and we will be sure to add you. I want to thank those who helped to put this program together, including Melanie Dudley, our Assistant Director and Program Manager, Emmy Beebe and Priscilla Holmes, and Nicole Garofano in our events office, Brian Sirac and his colleagues in Unit, Ethan Dewar and his colleagues in Communications. If you are seeking CLE credit, the forms are available right there. Don't forget to return them at the end of the program, and we will be sure that you get your credit. After this program, I'll remind you at the end, but we will have a reception in the student lounge, which is just on this level around the corner there, where we'll have some copies of Professor Guelzo's book, Lincoln Redeemer President, for him to sign, if you ask nicely, and we will have some food and drink for some hospitality. So it's my honor to introduce Alan Guelzo and to welcome him back to Villanova. He's been to Villanova before. In fact, he lives just up the road in Paoli. He is currently the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar and Director of the James Madison Program Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship at Princeton University. Previously, he was the Director of Civil War Era Studies and the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era at Gettysburg College. He holds an MA and PhD in History from the University of Pennsylvania. Among his many award-winning publications, he is the author of Abraham Lincoln Redeemer President, now in its second edition, which won both the Lincoln Prize and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Prize in 2000, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, The End of Slavery in America, which also won the Lincoln Prize and the Abraham Lincoln Institute Prize, Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America, a volume of essays, Abraham Lincoln as a Man of Ideas, Lincoln, A Very Short Introduction in the Oxford University Press series, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, which spent 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and also won the Lincoln Prize for 2014. His most recent publications are Redeeming the Great Emancipator, Harvard University Press 2016, and Reconstruction, A Concise History from Oxford University Press in 2018. As you can see, we have among us one of America's leading historians and leading historians of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, and it's a fitting way to conclude Constitution Month of September here at Villanova. Please join me in welcoming Alan Guelzo.
I am told that the clicker is non-lethal. If I point it at someone, it will not vaporize them. I'm relieved to know that. So are you. Edwin M. Stanton, who served for 3 years as Abraham Lincoln's presidential Secretary of War, gets only a footnote in Bartlett's familiar quotations. But it's a footnote that involves words that nearly everyone here surely knows by heart. The words that this normally irascible and overbearing powder keg of a man uttered at Abraham Lincoln's deathbed. Now he belongs to the ages. That at least was how John Hay, Lincoln's White House secretary, recorded Stanton's words when he and his co-author, John Nicolay, got around to writing their multi-million-word, 10-volume biography of their old boss in 1890. On the other hand, Dr. Charles Sabin Taft, who had been boosted awkwardly from the stage to the presidential box in Ford's Theater in Washington on the night of Lincoln's assassination, and who accompanied the dying Lincoln across 10th Street to the back bedroom of a rooming house owned by William Peterson, Taft thought that Stanton had said, "He now belongs to the ages." And yet another witness still, the stenographer whom Stanton drafted for service that night to take depositions from witnesses, Corporal James Tanner, didn't remember Stanton saying anything. The utmost silence pervaded, broken only by the sound of strong men's tears, wrote Tanner, until the Reverend Phineas Gurley proposed to say a prayer. Tanner would have recorded that, but his pencil broke. John Hay, however, spoke with authority, and every Lincoln biographer thereafter, starting with Ida Tarbell in 1900, has settled on "now he belongs to the ages" as the official Stantonian utterance. Well, maybe. The problem, of course, is that "now he belongs to the ages" is also, word for word, not very easy to parse. What exactly does it mean to belong to the ages? If you take it one way, it simply may be a secularized version of assigning Lincoln to the angels, with generations of memorial statues standing in for seraphim and cherubim. Take it another way, and it may simply mean that Lincoln's final deed has now been done, and all that is left of him from this point forward is the record of his accomplishments, with, sadly, nothing more to be added. At its most sinister, however, "now he belongs to the ages" could imply that just behind the undertakers, the historians and biographers would be lining up to take title to Lincoln and to reshape and remake and redefine his legacy. Stanton, who worked himself into an early grave in 1869, was never available to explain what it was he said or what it meant, or even to confirm if he said it. There is, however, some truth in seeing the uncertainty surrounding that inscrutable pronouncement about belonging to the ages as a marker of how Americans' estimate of Lincoln has changed over the 158 years since that night in the Peterson boarding house. I suppose that in the most general sense, there may not be much question of whether Lincoln belongs to the ages. Abraham Lincoln has always seemed to be the prize of every American age since 1865, whether it be the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, or Camelot. He's never failed to stand somewhere in the top 3 of the greatest American presidents, and he has remained a constant object of popular biography and scholarly research, and occasionally the subject of some disappointingly unpopular biography and some slightly unhinged fiction. For example, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. Where does that fit into "now he belongs to the ages"? But that's only one example. Try a few of these titles on for size. Abraham Lincoln's DNA and Other Adventures in Genetics. Abraham Lincoln, An Illustrated Biography in Postcards. Think you know about Lincoln? Try this one. Lincoln Unmasked, What You're Not Supposed to Know About Dishonest Abe. Capped off, for sure, by Lincoln and the Know Nothing movement. Lincoln has managed to peek into more movies, documentaries, and television serials than any other American politician, beginning in 1903 in a short Edison production of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he's won cameo appearances twice in The Twilight Zone, even once in the original Star Trek, and of course the title role of Steven Spielberg's Lincoln in 2012. Even Lincoln's statue has wangled a place in the movies, from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939, to the remake of Planet of the Apes in 2001, Legally Blonde in 2003, and Night at the Museum in 2009. Still, not all of this celebrity has been velvet-lined. Rarely, in fact, has a man so dedicated to moderation in politics been handled so immoderately. The Charleston, South Carolina newspapers began denouncing Lincoln as soon as he was nominated for the presidency in 1860, calling him a horrid-looking wretch, sooty and scoundrelly in aspect, a cross between the nutmeg dealer, the horse swapper, and the nightman. The Richmond newspapers were not much more charitable. Lincoln was an illiterate partisan of the abolitionists, possessed only of his inveterate hatred of slavery. Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, was evidently not a serious reader of Southern newspapers because 2 weeks after the Richmond Enquirer stamped Lincoln as an inveterate hater of slavery, Phillips denounced Lincoln as the slave hound of Illinois for refusing to condemn the fugitive slave law or to pledge the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. And all through his presidency, Lincoln was so tortured by partisan savagery that he told Orville Hickman Browning that if his fellow Republicans wish to get rid of me, I am sometimes half disposed to gratify them. At some points, the only way he could imagine an escape from the stress would be to take a rope and hang himself on one of the trees in the lawn south of the president's house. This was said by Lincoln while he was looking out at the trees through the window at the same time. But this, of course, is political criticism. That's the kind of routine carping that all politicians must endure. And all the nasty stuff of this nature written during his life was silenced by his death. This was partly because in the last few months of his presidency, the success of his policies finally hushed even the most shrill of his critics. Kentucky Governor Thomas Bramlett, who'd never been anything less than a thorn in Lincoln's side, admitted before a mass meeting in Louisville, Kentucky on April 18, 1865, "We have differed with him, but when the judgment of future events has come, we found we were differing blindly, that he was right and we were wrong. Experience and time has demonstrated that his was the only line of salvation for our country." And when at any point since have you heard a politician in public admit that he was wrong? Lincoln made at least one politician do that. But the silencing of criticism at the time of his death and thereafter was also due in part to the timing and manner of that death, which had so naturally impressed people with its similarities to martyrdom that criticizing Lincoln almost would seem like a breach of etiquette. If the old rule of don't speak evil of the dead ever had any force, it had it after Lincoln's assassination. There would always be private rumblings of dissent, especially in the defeated Confederacy. But even in the South, Joseph G. Hamilton was only stating what had become a nearly official Southern view in 1909, that Lincoln's death had been met with genuine regret by Southerners for the loss of a leader who was already regarded differently from the other prominent men in the North, and that ensuing decades had rendered the South proud of his Southern birth and blood, gladly acknowledging the debt that the South, not only as a part of the nation, but individually owes him, and placing him in the same category with Washington as a maker of the nation. Barry Schwartz, in his survey of Lincoln's reputation in Abraham Lincoln in the post-heroic era, has pegged the spring tide of Lincoln's reputation to the decades of the 1920s and 1930s. What has followed since then, despite the uptick in Lincoln interest during the 2009 bicentennial of Lincoln's birth, and the outpouring of Lincoln scholarship since the mid-1990s, has been something akin to Matthew Arnold's melancholy, long withdrawing roar on Dover Beach. There are, I think, 4 reasons for this decline in Lincoln's reputation. The first is simply the law of diminishing returns. By the 1930s, there was no one left around who could provide any new angles on Lincoln from personal knowledge of the man. The generation of people who had known Lincoln personally began to die off after 1890. Lincoln's old law partner, William Herndon, in 1891. His garrulous and publicity-seeking cousin, Dennis Hanks, in 1893. John Hay in 1905. Lincoln's niece, Harriet Chapman, in 1915. His son, Robert Todd Lincoln, in 1926. And his sister-in-law, Emily Todd Helm, in 1930. That meant that there was no new material on Lincoln to refresh what had already been said. And so books about Lincoln began to fall into a tired parade of repetition and more repetition. The famous muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell published the last Lincoln biography based on direct interviews in 1900. After that, writing about Lincoln increasingly acquired the exhausted sense of retreading already known facts and long-published material. And it led the major Lincoln biographer of that era, James G. Randall, to ask out loud in 1934, has the Lincoln theme been exhausted? Randall hoped not. And the upswelling of new writing and research on Lincoln from current-day historians like Michael Burlingame has shown what a hasty conclusion that was. But for much of the 20th century, Lincoln scholarship really did acquire a perception of weariness and dullness. A more politicized source for the shortening of Lincoln's stature after the 1920s is the reputation of progressivism and progressive politics after World War I. The progressive movement earned its heyday in the post-Civil War era from the mid-1880s until 1920. Progressives had as their principal figureheads New York's Theodore Roosevelt, New Jersey's Woodrow Wilson, but their real strength had been drawn geographically from the upper Midwest and from the new professional classes created by the breakneck industrialization and urbanization of the American economy in the post-Civil War decades. Progressivism worked from the basic assumption that American society had undergone so many dramatic changes in the years after the Civil War that the old, pre-Civil War America of self-reliant individualism and small producer business was gone forever. Progressives like Wilson believed that the disorder generated by those upheavals threw all the original calculations of the American founding off their base and laid Americans open to the greed and exploitation of Gilded Age robber barons and urban machine politics. The cure for this was the reshaping of American society in a new, more efficient, and more balanced fashion, designed by social professionals who understood the new dynamics of a new age. Progressives had long wanted to claim Lincoln as one of their own, and up through the 1920s they did. But there had always been warnings that Lincoln would not fit the progressive template quite so easily. Helen Nicolay, writing in the same year that Theodore Roosevelt struck out on his own to found the Progressive Party, 1912, doubted whether Lincoln could be tailored to wear progressive clothes. Lincoln, she said, was a man of the old pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps school of heroic economic individualism, and nearly out of place in a complex and industrialized 20th century America as mountain men and Indian fighters. The truth is, wrote Helen Nicolay, that Lincoln was no prophet of a distant day. His heart and mind were busy with the problems of his own time. The legacy he left his countrymen was not the warning of a seer, but an example and an obligation to face their own dark shadows with the sanity and courageous independence he showed in looking upon those who confronted him. His early life was essentially of the old era. He made his own career by individual effort. So when the country turned its back on progressivism after World War I, the progressives themselves turned on Lincoln criticizing Lincoln as a model of precisely the out-of-date, self-made man which they believed had deluded Americans into rejecting progressive policies. So long as that Lincoln was revered by Americans, he would be an obstacle to be attacked by progressives rather than a banner to fly. And attack they did. Edgar Lee Masters, the embittered Illinois progressive, wrote a sprawling and vicious attack on Lincoln in 1931, snarling at Lincoln for having no better than a country lawyer's understanding of the Constitution. And as president, having perverted the Constitution, began a reign of terror and crushed the principles of free government. A more subtle, but also more effective subversion of Lincoln by a progressive biographer came at the hands of Albert J. Beveridge, who had joined Theodore Roosevelt in founding the Progressive Party in 1912, who lost 3 elections as a progressive, and who turned to history writing as his consolation thereafter. Beveridge was the son of a Civil War veteran and had for years accepted on faith the idolization of Lincoln as the savior of the Union and the great emancipator. But as Beveridge turned to working on a multi-volume Lincoln biography in the 1920s, the Lincoln that his research unearthed turned out instead to be gigantically unprogressive, strongly conservative, and in firm support of vested interests and the conduct of business unmolested as far as possible by legislative or any kind of governmental interference, according to Beveridge. By the time Beveridge completed the 2nd volume of his biography, it was not Lincoln, but Stephen A. Douglas, who emerged in Beveridge's telling as the genuine man of the people, the enemy of special interests, and a progressive before his time in breaking with the Democratic Party leadership over the Lecompton Constitution. Ironically, this did not earn Lincoln very much in the way of respect from conservative political thinkers either, even after the rebirth of a conservative intellectual revival in the 1960s. Much of the conservative intellectual movement took its bearings from either European intellectuals, like Friedrich Hayek, who had fled the specter of Hitler's National Socialism, or from old-time Southern agrarians, and neither of them seemed to have much interest or affinity for Abraham Lincoln. The neo-agrarians, whether of the milder northern stamp of a Russell Kirk or the aggressive southern version championed by Melvin Bradford, saw Lincoln as the champion of a Yankee capitalism which was dissolving all traditional social connections in a cash nexus. The disciples of Hayek, with their suspicion of the incompetence of state management of economies, also saw Lincoln's presidency as the original model for an all-powerful welfare state. This despite the fact that Hayek, as an Austrian, knew very little about Lincoln and had almost nothing to say about Lincoln in his writings. But the last, and certainly the most surprising recalibration of the Lincoln legacy, emerged out of the civil rights movement. For 80 years and more after the Civil War, no single segment of American society clung more worshipfully to the image of Abraham Lincoln than African Americans. Henry Louis Gates wrote that, "When I was growing up, Lincoln's picture was in nearly every black home I can recall. The only white man, other than Jesus himself, to grace black family walls. Lincoln was a hero to us." And when Branch Rickey staged the famous photograph of Jackie Robinson signing the baseball contract that broke Major League Baseball's color line in 1947, the picture on the wall behind Robinson and Rickey was one of Lincoln. 60 years and more after Lincoln's death, however, and the great African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois was pouring scorn on Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a Southern poor white, of illegitimate birth, poorly educated, and unusually ugly, awkward, ill-dressed, Du Bois wrote. He liked smutty stories and was a politician down to his toes, And indeed, he had little outwardly that compelled respect. The only thing that gave Du Bois reason, even grudgingly, to notice Lincoln was that Lincoln was at least big enough to be inconsistent, despising Negroes and letting them fight and vote, protecting slavery and freeing slaves. He was a man, a big, inconsistent, brave man. It was from that new baseline that black skepticism about Lincoln increasingly uncoiled, delivered in its most antagonistic form in 1968 by Lerone Bennett on the pages of Ebony magazine, in an article deliberately designed to shock. Was Abraham Lincoln a white supremacist? Born in Mississippi, while Jim Crow still ruled Mississippi's public life, Bennett had been raised to revere Lincoln. It was not until he stumbled across Lincoln's opening remarks during the fourth Lincoln-Douglas debate, where Lincoln said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." Not until Bennett read that did Bennett's reverence for Lincoln break into pieces. From there, Bennett developed a critique of Lincoln, which declared that Lincoln was a confirmed racist, that Lincoln had never planned to free the slaves, and that the Emancipation Proclamation was a window-dressing fraud, and that Lincoln was no role model for either blacks or whites. "I was just absolutely shocked," Bennett told Brian Lamb in 2000, "because I find it difficult to understand how people could say this man was the greatest apostle of brotherhood in the United States of America." After that, Bennett found that he had to speak of Lincoln from a different perspective, the perspective of the truly disinherited. As the managing editor of a major national magazine and a graduate of Morehouse College, Bennett was not exactly an example of the truly disinherited, but Bennett certainly spoke for a generation of middle-class African Americans who did not understand why they should render homage to a white man who now seemed so far below the level of their own expectations. By the time we arrive at 2023, Abraham Lincoln no longer seems to be part of many modern American stories, much less belonging to the ages. And the general image of Lincoln is in poor repair. He is still in the movies and TV, but frequently as a figure of jest, as in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where he figures delivering an exhortation not to dedicate themselves to the unfinished work of democracy, but to party on, dudes. Or else he is portrayed as a comic book superhero, or on the dust jacket of Jon Stewart's Naked Pictures of Famous People, or in commercials for Geico, Mountain Dew, and for sleep medications where Lincoln's companions are a deep-sea diver and a talking beaver. Among black chroniclers of the black experience, Vincent Harding, Barbara Field, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Lincoln has become stigmatized as a racist who, according to one participant in a roundtable hosted by the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission in 2007, never believed that blacks were equal to whites, and instead helped establish the negative view of the Negro that still exists today. At the other end of the spectrum, partisans on the right attacked Lincoln as an enemy of free markets and limited government, as though they had never heard that slavery is the ultimate negation of free markets, and that limited government does not mean that states can dispense with the Constitution at will and arrive at no government. No history department in any Ivy League university, not Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, Columbia, Cornell, Princeton, even my own alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, offers any course of study focused on Abraham Lincoln, although the politics departments at Yale and Princeton do. Neither Howard University, nor Morehouse College, nor Spelman College, all of them historically black institutions, offer any history course, seminar, or colloquium on Abraham Lincoln. And even Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, another historically black university, features no entry in its course catalog which mentions Abraham Lincoln. Nor, for that matter, does the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, nor does Knox College, where the fifth Lincoln-Douglas debate took place. And yet, for all of the mud hurled at Lincoln from so many different quarters, his image still persists, is still with us as the man who belongs to the ages. And it does so, I suspect, because much of this mud is really little more than wet silliness and evaporates under the application of a few questions. Lincoln did not free the slaves? Really? Then whose name is at the bottom of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment? Of course, it can be, and often is, argued that neither of these documents freed the slaves either, that the slaves freed themselves by running away, both before and after the Civil War, and without any help from Uncle Abe. And true enough, slaves did free themselves, but only in the same way that escapees from prison free themselves. Neither slaves nor convicts make themselves legally free by escaping, and they are liable to be recaptured and returned to prison or to slavery whenever they are recaptured. To be free, one must be free in law as well as in fact. Just as the owner of a car or a house must possess that car or house by legal title as much as by actual occupation. And that legal title to the slave's freedom came and could only have come from Lincoln. Was Lincoln a racist? If he was, then why would he have bothered with emancipation at all? It certainly wasn't because he needed black votes, because there were hardly any in the Civil War North, thanks to black codes that disenfranchised all but a handful of free black voters. And it certainly wasn't because he needed the abolitionist vote, because there weren't that many abolitionists to start with. And it was not because he was trying to fend off intervention by Great Britain or France, because it was precisely emancipation which had convinced the British government that Lincoln's proclamation would trigger a servile insurrection, which only British intervention could avert. Was Lincoln racially insensitive? At times, yes. But was he a racist? Does a racist arm black men and send them into battle to kill white racists? Does a racist consciously run the risk of costing his party command of Congress and generating lynch mobs in the streets of New York City on behalf of emancipation? Lincoln wanted to destroy federalism and states' rights. Long before Lincoln was born, the Constitution itself already severely limited the circle of rights belonging to the states back in 1787. States were barred from coining money, could not enter into treaties or alliances, could not impose export or import taxes, could not maintain armies or navies. What the Civil War settled was that states had no specific right to secession, and that states could not trump national citizenship. If there was ever a direct assault on states' rights, it came from progressivism in the name of efficiency, and marked by progressivism's two greatest constitutional achievements: the amendments providing for the direct election of senators in 1912 and for a direct federal income tax in 1913. Was Lincoln a dictator? If so, the most obvious way to have become a dictator would be simply to have suspended all elections in 1862 and 1864 on the grounds of national emergency. And surely, if ever there was a crisis for a president not to let go to waste, the Civil War was it. And yet Lincoln not only submitted to the test of democratic elections, but acknowledged that his greatest project, the Emancipation Proclamation, might very easily be overturned by the federal courts once the war was over. And yet, he took no step to suppress the courts. Still, we do not need to make Lincoln a saint in order to determine whether he still belongs to the ages. But we do need to step away from the arrogance of presumption, the presumption that we are the best judges of his own mind, that we are entitled to substitute our grievances for the real troubles of his time, that we are permitted to demand a perfection, an orderliness, and a level of insight that we can't even impose on our own checkbooks. Because only then will we recognize how very extraordinary the achievements of the man really were. And beyond just Lincoln's political accomplishments, there is also the appeal of the man himself that makes him belong to the ages. What keeps him a subject of such perennial attention? Partly, I think, mystery, because he was so relentlessly private a man. Partly, it's mystification, because he outfoxed his opponents by inducing them to underestimate him. Partly, it's a set of personality traits, like his humor, his humility, his perspective, his resilience, traits which are the necessary components of democratic political leadership. They contrast strikingly with the aspects of monarchical leadership, because that is about honor and style and the acquisition of power. Or even bureaucratic leadership, which is about efficiency, competence, and procedure. What Lincoln shows us is a model of democratic political leadership. We live in a cynical age, which has a hard time even believing in superheroes, much less heroes. And certainly that cynicism has played a role in the decline of Lincoln's reputation. But to take the measure of the man's accomplishments and to stare into the complex depths of his personality reveals a man before whom cynicism bows out backwards. So with all due respect to the cynics, I'm inclined to agree with John Hay. He does, indeed, belong to the ages. Thank you very much. Yes, please, go ahead. Stand up so everyone can hear your question, too.
I used to sort of ponder whether Lincoln was an evolving personality like Irving Boner point use, or whether he had certain core principles from when he was younger, like he talked about, say, the black slaves on the way down Mississippi. And I put the incident or situation which illuminated the best to me was in the lead up to the 1864 election. He got those poll results which were inaccurate, that he was going to lose. And his big project was to make sure emancipation of freed slaves continued, and had these conversations with Richard Douglas. That seemed to be his primary objective.
It's interesting this way because Lincoln does two things with the 1864 election in perspective. One is he does say, quite frankly, to Frederick Douglass, I want you to take my commission and I want you to go south into those areas of the South which have been restored to Union control. I want you from those places to preach emancipation and to encourage as many as are still held in bondage to run, to flee. Get out of the Confederate-held areas, get into the Union-held areas, where at least you've got a chance. The other aspect of that is his willingness to abide by what might be the outcome of the 1864 election. Because at the end of August 1864, He didn't have polls as we understand them today, but he did have a fairly decent sense of how you figure out where public opinion is going. At the end of August 1864, he had concluded he was going to lose, and was going to lose badly, to George B. McClellan, the Democratic candidate. And when his cabinet assembles, and he calls this meeting specially, I think, for this purpose, he has them sign a document that he has written. Doesn't let them read it, but he has them sign it as a way of endorsement, as a way of witnessing that this isn't just a document that he would confect later as a way of covering his tracks. It's not until after the election takes place in November, and he is triumphantly reelected, that he reads to his cabinet what he had written and asked them to endorse. And the statement was, "It appears now that this administration will not be reelected. And if that is the case, then it will be our obligation to do everything in our power, either A, to bring the war to a swift and speedy conclusion now, before the inauguration of the next president, or else to make the way smooth for the succession of another president." He never once has the idea that somehow he is going to overturn the election. And this is in the middle of a civil war. He has been presiding over this war, hoping he's bringing it to a successful conclusion, and now fears that it's about to be snatched away from him by this election. How many of us could resist the temptation to say, look, this is not the moment to hold a national election. We'll cancel the election. We'll postpone the election. That just never seems to have occurred to Lincoln. After the re-election, a great crowd comes to the White House to participate in a serenade, cheering him on. He comes out and speaks to them, and he says, you know, it would have been very easy to have canceled this election, but if we had, that would have been a betrayal of the Constitution. And if we betrayed the Constitution, wouldn't that have been the same as just giving the whole store away to the people that we are trying to deal with? Wouldn't that be to justify the Confederates? They raised their hands against the Constitution. If we turn around and raise our hands against the Constitution, aren't we guilty of the same thing? So Lincoln says we can't have a democracy without free elections. And that's true, even if we lose them. That's part of the rules of the game in a democracy. You take your chances at an election. Why? Because it is the people who are sovereign in a democracy. They make the decisions, not the bureaucrats, not the office holders, not the members of Congress. It is the people who make the decision. And knowing that, Lincoln says, we have to concede. We have to concede. It is the people who are sovereign. Now, it turned out right for us, but if we had tried to do something to rig that, to make that happen a different way, or even to cancel it, that would have been to undermine the very cause that we're fighting for. When you hear that from a president, when you hear that from any politician, then you're hearing something which I think has to give you a tremendous sense of reassurance. That not only is this an individual who is worth trusting, but also an individual who believes as firmly in the principles of democracy as we ourselves do. And that tends to happen fairly rarely. But you get this with Lincoln. I'll give you another example on a slightly different subject. In July of 1862, a Unionist in Louisiana wrote to Lincoln, complaining about the way the Union occupation of Louisiana was going on and being conducted. Lincoln writes back to him. His name was Cuthbert Bullitt. And first of all, Lincoln says, look, you're complaining about the Union occupation of Louisiana. This only happened because you people caused the trouble in the first place. So in a sense, you've got to take your medicine. But then he goes on to say, nevertheless, whatever we're going to do is not going to be done out of anger or revenge or spite. And he concludes the letter by saying, I shall do nothing in malice. What we deal with is too great for malicious dealing. When you hear words like that from a man possessing the kind of powers that came to Lincoln's hands during the Civil War, then you're dealing with a remarkable individual. That's why I'm willing to say yes to the question, does he belong to the ages? A remarkable person not to say a remarkable president. All those incidents, yes. Yes?
This is necessarily an opinion question. Do you think that if Lincoln knew before the Civil War began the carnage that was going to ensue, do you think he would have taken the same tact and just said, well, okay, 750,000 dead is worth it to preserve the Union? It's always troubled me because he was a compassionate man in many ways. He didn't execute many people, despite having the power to do it. Commuted a lot of people, and yet it just has always torn me as to whether he would have just said, "Yeah, I got to do it."
This is a good question. This is a good question. Now, I can at best only give a speculative answer, 160 years away from the man himself. But let me point at least to two incidents. In July of 1864, a Confederate force under Jubal Early swung north, crossed the Potomac, menaced the defenses of Washington, D.C. Lincoln went out to Fort Stevens, which was part of the fortifications circling Washington, to have a look for himself. And he stood up on the parapet, just as Confederate skirmishers were perhaps 150, 200 yards away. And how many of those Confederate skirmishers would necessarily have mistaken this very tall man with the stovepipe hat? It would not have been, who is that? Who do you suppose that is? Yeah, all right. And one officer, the legend is that it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who would later become a associate justice of the Supreme Court, shouted, "Get down, you fool, before you get shot," which is not exactly the best term of address for your commander-in-chief, but it doesn't seem to have hurt Holmes, if indeed it was Holmes. That's one incident. There's another incident, too. In April of 1865, after Richmond, the Confederate capital, has fallen, Lincoln goes to visit the Union Army there, and he boards a Union gunboat that takes him up the James River to Richmond, the ruined city of Richmond itself. And he debarks from the gunboat, and with his son Tad, and nothing more than a small guard of armed sailors and Marines, proceeds to walk up the streets of Richmond for an interview he's going to have with the new federal commandant of occupied Richmond. He's walking through these streets. You're thinking, what would it take for some nutcase with a shotgun in an upper window along that street to have decided that they were going to take revenge for the way the war was going? And it's moments like that that make me wonder, as my old colleague Gabor Borat once wondered, was Lincoln doing that because he was saying to himself, God, if I am wrong, let it end here? It's a speculation, but it's a speculation that I have a sense comes very close to the man himself. The losses of the war were so unprecedented. There was nothing in the American experience that came close to the cyclone of violence represented by the American Civil War. And Lincoln had to look at that and to ask, am I responsible for this? Did I cause this? And it's that which leads him on the 4th of March, 1865, in his second inaugural, to pose the question, if we shall suppose that this war is sent upon us as a judgment by God, a judgment to both North and South, because both North and South have had their hands in the toilet with slavery. If we shall suppose that this war is a judgment visited upon both North and South, then aren't we forced to say, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And in a sense, what Lincoln does is to appeal your question to, let's say, a higher court, and to ask, is this not in some mysterious way the will of God? The will of God in the form of a judgment and a punishment on all of us, that no one can back off from it and say, oh, we were innocent, we were not responsible for slavery. Now, his perception is, this is something that we all must have a share in, and therefore the burden of it falls on all of us, no matter how severe the burden. And it's at that moment he pivots to that last paragraph in the second inaugural. with malice toward none. That word malice again. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Why without malice? Why should we exercise charity? It's not because it's not because he's a nice guy. It's because he has weighed the costs in the balances. And after those costs have been exacted, how do we live with each other afterwards? We can only do it, he says, by doing it without malice, by doing it with charity as God gives us to see the right, bind up the wounds of the war, find peace with ourselves and with all nations. And I think in the broadest sense, that may be the answer to your question. Yeah. Yes, please.
So I think the short form of my question might be, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, this was asked, why did he sign it? My question is, when he signed it, did that reflect a change in his understanding of the war aim? So when he started the war, presumably he said, I just want union, and I'll have it with slavery or without it. And people like McClellan, if I recall, a Democrat, was sort of much more open to sort of not really reforming Southern society. He just wanted to cease the war, and the South would stay as it is for the most part. So when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, some people might just say, well, this was just a war tactic, right? He wanted to destabilize the Southern Army. It didn't create a slave so there were states that were not in rebellion, even if constitutional authority to do that. So his ideas of the war aims changed, and when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that Emancipation changed.
Right. That sometimes takes the form of a question that's asked about Lincoln. If Lincoln really was in earnest about the subject of slavery, why did he wait 2 years into the war? Why the day after Fort Sumter surrendered? Why didn't he just declare the slaves free then? His pen was on his desk. Why couldn't he just picked up his pen, signed a proclamation right there freeing the slaves? All right, there's a number of reasons. First of all, don't underestimate the speed with which Lincoln moved on the subject of slavery. Within 6 months of taking his oath of office, he already had devised an emancipation plan, but it was a plan that would work through the states. And the reason it's going to work through the states is this. The federal government, the United States government, had never had any kind of statute legalizing slavery. Slavery was always a state enactment. It was state statutes that made slavery. Therefore, in this era, before there's an incorporation doctrine, there's this firewall between federal and state jurisdictions. He cannot simply, as president, throw open the window of his White House office and yell, "Free" down Pennsylvania Avenue. He did not have authority to do that as president of the United States. And he's aware of that. And he's also aware of the fact that if he did, in fact, do that, the next day, slave owners from the border states who had not seceded from the Union would be in federal court asking for an injunction. And of course, the injunction would get appealed up through the federal courts, and it would wind up finally in the United States Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court was at that moment who? Roger B. Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision. And how do you suppose Chief Justice Taney would respond to a unilateral action on Lincoln's part as president doing that? Not friendly, not friendly. So Lincoln has to keep his eye on the consequences of his actions. So he makes a proposal. He goes to the states and he says, we will buy out your slaves. Goes to the state of Delaware, where there were only still at that point 1,700 and some slaves. And he offers the state of Delaware $700,000 in United States bonds. This, for the state of Delaware, take this, buy out the slave owners in your state. And if that takes place, then he can turn to Maryland. If that works in Maryland, he can turn to Kentucky. Works in Kentucky, you can turn to Missouri. If you've secured the border states, you can say to the Confederates, you've got no hope. You've got no hope of a future. You might as well come back into the Union, and then I can proceed with the same plan. And Lincoln's longtime friend and jurist, David Davis, whom he'll later appoint to the Supreme Court, said that Lincoln really believed that was the plan that was going to eliminate slavery. Now, of course, you're thinking, sounds like a pretty expensive plan for getting rid of slavery. Oh, it was. Not nearly as expensive as Civil War. So he had that. The difficulty was that those border states threw it right back in his face. They didn't want to cooperate. And by that time, by March of 1862, he has finally decided he's going to have to pursue a different strategy. And that strategy is what follows his war powers as President of the United States. Because he's the commander-in-chief, according to the Constitution. If you're going to be a commander-in-chief, you should have some war powers in how to run a war. What's going to be the best way to end the Confederacy? Declare its slaves free on the strength of his military authority as commander-in-chief. He can't do it as president, as a civilian president, but the theory is that he can do it as military commander-in-chief. And that is how he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you read the very first paragraph of the Emancipation Proclamation, it talks about military necessity. It's not because he was half-hearted on the subject. It's because legally and constitutionally, that was his only possible path open. Now, people sometimes read the Emancipation Proclamation and scratch their heads. This is a very legalistic document. It's boring, not to put too fine a point. I mean, look, the Emancipation Proclamation begins with this word, whereas. All right, you don't expect too much from that. Why is it dull? Because it has work to do. The Gettysburg Address is eloquent. The second inaugural is eloquent. But don't try to recite them to the state trooper who pulls you over on the turnpike for going 90 miles an hour. It won't get you anywhere. The Emancipation Proclamation is different. It is a legal document. It makes 3 million people free. And and ultimately that's the answer here. He is aimed at that from the very start. Now he says in his letter to Horace Greeley in August of 1862, my aim is to restore the Union. And if I can restore the Union by freeing some of the slaves, I'll do that. If I can restore the Union by freeing all the slaves, I'll do that. If I can preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I'll do that. And again, people have looked at that and said, see, he's half-hearted. He's not really caring about the slaves, he's caring about the Union. Walk back for a moment. What American president before Abraham Lincoln would ever have dared to write a public letter saying that I might free the slaves, I might free some of them, or I might free some of them, or I might free all of them? What American president would ever have done that? And you picture people in 1862 reading that, and all the hardcore pro-slavery people are clutching their chests and falling over in the pew in front of them. Because no American president would have ever dreamt of even hinting that he would want to emancipate slaves. And yet Lincoln does it, and it's a very typical Lincolnian way of doing it, almost offhandedly, without drawing any particular degree of attention to it. This was Lincoln's way. And yet there it is, the first president ever even to remotely suggest he would do that. And then, of course, there are his own statements about slavery. In the spring of 1864, he tells a Kentucky newspaper editor and a former governor of Kentucky who has come to pay a call on him in the White House. They ask him about his views on slavery. He says, I've always hated slavery. I cannot remember a time when I did not so think and feel. But then he goes on to say, I couldn't act purely on my own discretion. I had to remember that I was president. I had to remember that there were legal and constitutional constraints. And it's knowing that he had those constraints and that he couldn't throw them by, which makes him a great political strategist. Richard Hofstadter, a great American historian, once said that the Emancipation Proclamation reads like a bill of lading. And I thought to myself, reading that, yeah, it is. It is a bill of lading. It's a bill of lading describing a cargo of 3 million people being delivered to the port of freedom. And he's going to write it in exactly the way that will guarantee that they get there. People afterwards asked him, are you just bluffing with the proclamation? Would you use it as a bargaining chip with the Confederates to get them to the negotiating table? And his response to one judge who put that question to him was this: I will not recall the proclamation. If I did that, I would be damned in time and eternity. But not just individually. In his State of the Union address in 1863 and 1864, they didn't call it the State of the Union then, but in this message he gives to Congress, he says very plainly, I will not recall the proclamation. If the people, by their votes, or Congress by its actions, wants to have the proclamation recalled, another, and not I, will have to do it. In other words, I will resign the presidency before I will do that. I think that says about as clearly as you can say it what his commitment to emancipation was. Lincoln once said that his mind was like a piece of steel, very hard to write something on it, but once you did get it scratched on there, you couldn't get it out. And that was his commitment about emancipation. One more. All the way in the back. Yes, please.
I think that when political aim to preserve the Union and this military prosecution of the war, I'm more thinking about the way Garrison's Lincoln for the war was kind of small and contradictory in itself. And I guess the question is, did Lincoln begin the war for his own political ends?
I don't know that any politician ever enters on any policy without seeing some degree of advantage accruing to themselves. But did he see war as the advantage? After he's elected, he embarks on an inaugural tour that takes him from his home in Springfield, Illinois, finally to Washington. And all through that tour, he keeps insisting there isn't going to be any war. All this talk from the Southerners about war and about civil war, this is all just rhetoric. And there were a lot of people who agreed with him. Carl Schurz, for instance, said, you know, back in 1850, the Southerners were talking about secession and civil war. They walked out. They took a drink, and they came back. Well, you know what's going to happen now, said Schurz? They're going to walk out, and they're going to take 2 drinks, and then they'll come back. And many people around Lincoln really believed, as Lincoln himself did, that it was not inevitable that civil war was going to be the result of this contest over slavery. Even the Civil War needed to happen as a result of Southern secession, because if you could slow down the process, if you could make the formation of the Southern Confederacy look impotent, then Southern Unionist sentiment on its own would reassert itself and bring an end to this crisis. And this is why in the crisis over Fort Sumter, in March and April of 1861. This is why he hits on the plan to resupply Fort Sumter with just food and equipment, no soldier reinforcements, largely because he didn't have enough in the way of soldier reinforcements to send at that moment. And why is he offering to do that? It's because he wants to run the clock. Because the longer a federal garrison holds out in Fort Sumter, smack in the middle of the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, as long as the Stars and Stripes is still flying over that fort, and the longer it does, the more ridiculous Southern secession looks. Which is also why, in April of 1861, the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, decides, no, we can't go into extra innings. Because if we do, we'll lose politically. The Upper South won't go with us. Southern Unionists in the seceded states will reassert themselves. No, we can't. We have to attack Fort Sumter. We have to show that we have the military strength to do that. And so they go ahead. Was that Lincoln's plan? I think Lincoln would much rather have spun things out, get them to some kind of negotiating, avert war, and then put the process of emancipation into work. And Southerners saw this. That was why they seceded in the first place. I mean, if they had not looked at Lincoln and said, this means the end of slavery sooner or later, why would they have seceded? To amuse themselves? No. They leave the Union beginning in December of 1860 and running through into May of 1861, because they know Lincoln is the handwriting on the wall, that there will be no new slave states, there will be no expansion of slavery into the Western territories, there will be no legalization of slavery in the Western territories. We're going to build a Berlin Wall around slavery, and inside that wall, it's going to asphyxiate, because slavery always needs new territory to expand into. It was the Confederacy which realized it couldn't stand the clock running. It had to strike. And the war came. Michael, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions in particular.
Well, thank you all again for being here. Again, we have a reception around the corner here, and we have some books to give away there. CLE forms right here. And please join us again for future events down the road here at the McCullen Center. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in thanking Professor Guelzo again.